The sea hides more than it ever gives back. Passengers see glittering lights and laughter, but crew walk the decks where screams seep through steel and shadows wear familiar faces. These are the stories you were never meant to hear. And once you do, the ocean will never feel safe again, and the sea air was damp, heavy with salt and diesel, the kind that sticks to your throat and leaves you tasting iron. The line of passengers stretched across the gangway like a procession of restless ghosts, each clutching tickets, passports, luggage tags, their chatter filling the night with a nervous hum. My job was simple. Verify the names, check them off the manifest, send them on their way. I had done this 100 times before, half asleep, scribbling without care. But that night was different. He came through near the end of the boarding when the line had thinned and silence was beginning to creep back in. The man in the gray coat moved like smoke, slow but unbroken. And when he reached me, he did not look at the paper in my hand. He looked directly into my face, and his eyes were dull as seawater, a murky, lifeless color that made me flinch before I could stop myself. His skin had that strange translucence you see in hospital patients, waxy, pale, as though the blood had long since retreated deeper than it should. He handed me a ticket with fingers that felt far too cold for the warm Caribbean night. I stammered his name aloud, though now, thinking back, I cannot recall what it was. I only remember the sound of it catching in my throat, like I had spoken something I was not supposed to. He did not answer, did not nod in acknowledgement, only held my stare long enough to make my chest tighten with a strange dread. Then, just as suddenly, he moved past me, slipping into the stream of families and honeymooners and retirees, blending into the crowd so seamlessly that I almost wondered if I had imagined him. For a moment, I just stood there with his ticket still in my hand, the ink bleeding faintly into the sweat of my palm, the paper colder than it should have been. I called after him, but my voice was swallowed by the shuffle of feet and the scrape of rolling suitcases against the metal deck. One of the senior staff noticed me lingering and told me to keep the line moving. I shoved the ticket into the folder, my hand trembling, and forced myself to check off the name. Yet, even as I did, something gnawed at me. Every other passenger that night had passed with chatter and noise, the kind of warmth you expect from people about to embark on a week of drinks, music, and turquoise water. But him, he had carried with him a silence so deep it would seem to stick to my uniform. His face had no expression, no sign of joy or even weariness. It was blank, like something carved and hollow. When the last passengers boarded and the gangway was pulled in, I should have forgotten him. But as the ship's horn bellowed and the lights along the coast disappeared into the dark, I felt the weight of his stare still pressing against the back of my skull. I knew, without knowing how, that I had let something aboard that was never meant to sail with us. By the time the last of the boarding chaos had settled and the ship cut its path through the dark water, I had nearly convinced myself that the gray-coated man was only another face among many. The sea was calm, the night air filled with the usual chorus of drunken laughter and the shuffle of late diners wandering the decks. But when I sat down to complete the roster check, my unease returned with a sharp edge. Every cabin was accounted for. Every name ticked off except his. His room number glared up at me from the list, waiting to be marked. But the cabin sat untouched. I took the spare key and went myself. The corridor was quiet, unnaturally so. Cruise ships never sleep, yet this particular stretch of hall felt drained of sound, as though the air itself had been emptied. The door bore his cabin number, neat and brass polished. Yet something about it looked wrong, like it belonged to a place older than the ship itself. I knocked once, twice, listening for footsteps, for any rustle of sheets or creak of furniture. Nothing. Only the thrum of the engines deep below. I pressed my ear against the door, expecting at least the faint shuffle of movement. Instead, I heard something else. Breathing. Slow, ragged, heavy. It came in intervals, the kind of sound you hear from a sick man in the grip of fever dreams. I whispered his name, the one I had read earlier on the ticket. Though speaking it aloud again made my tongue feel clumsy and my chest tighten. The breathing stopped instantly, cut off as though whoever or whatever was inside had been caught listening. I rattled the handle, locked. I tried again, harder this time. The door held firm. My pulse quickened, a drumbeat in my ears, and I told myself I would use the master key. But when I reached for the slot, my hand froze. Something in me, primal and wordless, refused to put that key in. It was as though the lock itself wasn't meant to be opened, that by crossing the threshold, I would step into a place I was not supposed to. I knocked again, louder, my voice cracking as I called for an answer, any answer at all. The corridor stretched around me, empty, the light above flickering once, then twice. And in that thin flutter, I swore I saw a shadow pass across the bottom of the door. Not the slim movement of feet, but something taller, like a figure pacing in silence on the other side, waiting. I backed away, my breath shallow, the roster sheet clutched against my chest. The door remained still, the brass number glinting under the dull light. And though I left it behind, walking quickly, almost running, I could not shake the feeling that whatever was inside had stopped pacing the moment I turned my back, and was now standing at the door, head bowed, ear pressed to the wood, listening to me retreat. Morning brought no comfort, only the thin ache of sleeplessness and a gnawing unease that clung to me like the damp salt in the air. I reported to the staff office with the roster sheet still creased from the night before, the unmarked cabin glaring at me like an accusation. The supervisors gathered with their coffee and clipboards, voices low and practical as always. But when I raised the subject of the man in the gray coat, their expressions turned blank. They told me no such passenger existed. The ticket number I had scribbled down did not appear anywhere in the manifest. They pulled up the records on their screens, page after page of names and details scrolling by, but his was not among them. They insisted I must have been tired, mistaken, confusing one guest for another. Yet I remembered the weight of his stare too vividly, the cold press of his ticket against my palm, the way his silence had bled into me like ink into water. I asked about the cabin, about the door that had been locked from the inside. One of the officers frowned and explained that the room I mentioned had been out of service for years. Left empty after a pipe burst had damaged the walls. No one was booked there, no keys were assigned. I told them I had heard breathing, heavy and ragged, but they only exchanged glances, muttering that perhaps I was hearing things. Fatigue, they said. Isolation, maybe. Ships make noises, wood and steel shifting, air ducts carrying sounds from far away. It was easier for them to explain it all away than to admit something was wrong. But I could not let it go. I asked for the boarding footage, the camera records from the night before. They humored me at first, pulling up the grainy video of the line moving across the gangway, passengers flashing tickets, luggage wheels clattering on steel. There I was at my station, clear as day, checking names, smiling stiffly, ushering them through. But when the moment should have come, when I remembered the man stepping forward, the footage faltered. The screen smeared with static, the seconds blurring, and when the image cleared again, the place where he should have been was empty. I felt the blood drain from my face as the others shrugged and clicked to another angle, showing only the endless stream of ordinary passengers. To them, there was no anomaly, only corrupted footage, nothing more. But I knew better. I had been there. I had spoken his name, felt his breath chill the air between us. The rest of the day I moved through my duties like a ghost, the laughter of tourists and the endless music from the pool deck sounding distant, wrong. Every time I passed a reflective surface, a porthole, a polished wall, a strip of glass, I expected to see him standing just behind me. My co-workers teased, told me to get more sleep. But I could feel the weight of his absence pressing against me heavier than his presence ever had. Because the truth was worse than if he had been real. Worse than if he had been a stowaway or a fraud. His ticket did not exist. His cabin did not exist. And yet, I had let him aboard. I should have stopped asking questions. That's what the others told me. Leave it. Forget it. Don't invite trouble where none needs to be. But the thought of him lingered like a splinter buried beneath the skin. I couldn't stop myself. So late that night, I went to security. The officer on duty was half bored, scrolling through endless reels of silent footage, the hum of the ship vibrating through the small room. I asked about the gray-coated man, the cabin, anything at all that might prove I wasn't losing my mind. With a sigh, the officer pulled up the recordings from the passenger decks. And there he was. The image made my stomach twist, because it wasn't that I had been mistaken. He existed, moving steadily through the halls, that same long coat trailing at his sides, shoulders slightly hunched. But the cameras didn't capture him the way they should have. His body was always softened, blurred at the edges, as though a mist hung only around him. And his face, no matter which angle the cameras caught, was smeared with static, a gray smudge that pulsed and warped like a screen struggling to tune to a channel that didn't exist. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the monitor. The officer shifted uncomfortably, muttering about corrupted data or camera malfunctions. But I knew better. The ship's cameras had been recording for years without issue. The distortion was him. It clung to him like a second skin, refusing to let the world see him clearly. I watched as he moved through corridor after corridor, never stopping, never sitting. His pace was even, unhurried. Yet there was purpose in the way he turned corners, retraced steps, circled entire decks as if mapping them out. And he wasn't wandering aimlessly. Every so often he would pause at a cabin door, stand still for several minutes, then move on. Some doors he returned to more than once, lingering longer each time. When I asked which cabins those were, the officer tapped at the manifest. Families, couples, honeymooners. People sound asleep while the blurred figure stood outside, silent and waiting. The officer laughed nervously, said it was nothing, a glitch, a reflection. But I saw the truth in his eyes. He was afraid too. On one screen, the man stopped at a crew stairwell. He turned his head toward the camera, and though his face was only static, the pressure of that smudge fixed on me. I swear he knew I was watching. For several long seconds, he didn't move, the distorted haze almost pressing against the lens, humming faintly through the speakers. Then, without warning, the feed cut to black. When it returned, the hall was empty. The officer switched off the monitor, refusing to show me more. He told me to go, to sleep, to stop chasing shadows. But all through the night, I walked the ship in silence, unable to stop searching. And every corner I turned, every reflection I caught in the polished steel walls, I half expected to see him waiting, blurred, faceless, yet staring straight at me. By the next morning, the footage was gone. I asked for it again, demanded it, but the security team only exchanged uneasy glances before one of them finally told me it had been deleted. Official reason: corrupted files. Unusable. The same cameras that captured drunks vomiting in stairwells and children sneaking into restricted decks without a flicker of error had somehow failed when it came to him. They erased every trace, every blurred figure, every smudge of static that proved what I had seen. And then they told me, kindly, firmly, to forget. Ships run on silence as much as on steel, and trouble is buried quickly when the passengers might catch the scent of it. I tried at first. I buried the memory, folded it into the routine of lifeboat drills, housekeeping checks, and smiling at tourists as though the ship were nothing more than a floating paradise. But forgetting proved impossible, because he did not stay in that cabin. He did not stay in the cameras. He did not stay locked in that single voyage. On the next trip, as we pulled from the harbor, I saw him again. The same gray coat, heavy with salt, the fabric clinging as if he had just climbed, dripping from the sea. He stood at the railing on the far end of the promenade deck, face tilted toward the dark horizon. I froze where I was, knowing what I saw and praying no one else would notice. No one did. Families strolled past him without a glance. Children ran laughing at his feet. Couples leaned against the same railing inches away, blind to the figure that loomed among them. Each voyage after, he was there. Sometimes at dusk, sometimes in the deep hours of the night when only crew moved through the ship. Always the same place, the same posture. Hands resting lightly on the rail, head bowed as if listening to something beneath the waves. The sea dripped constantly from the hem of his coat, though the decks remained dry around him. I never spoke of it again. Not to my supervisors, not to other staff. But I learned to watch for him, the way you might watch the slow drift of thunderclouds on the horizon. Because each time, he wasn't alone for long. He was waiting. And sooner or later, someone would join him. It began with small things. Passengers reported missing for a few hours, found wandering the wrong deck, dazed, unable to explain how they had gotten there. Then came those who vanished entirely, names whispered quickly among staff before being stricken from manifests. Always the same story. Last seen near the promenade, last seen at the railing. I know now what he is. Not a passenger, not a man. He is something the sea let climb aboard, and the ship carries him from port to port, voyage to voyage, hunting. I see him still, on every departure. Standing against the endless black water, coat dripping, eyes dull and waiting. And one day, when the decks are quiet and my shift is long, I know he will turn his head and wait for me. The pool was mine after midnight. Tourists never thought about what happened once the laughter and splashing stopped, once the lights dimmed and the deck turned hollow with silence. My job was simple: drain it, scrub it, flush the filters, and leave it shining like a glass coffin before sunrise. I had done it for years, humming to myself in the chemical stink, the roar of the pumps so loud it drowned out thought. But one night, in that steel belly of noise, I heard something else. Not the churn of water, not the grind of machinery. Screams. They were faint at first, thin as whispers pressed through layers of glass and liquid, but they were there. Long, dragging cries, muffled like a child buried under blankets, or worse, like voices calling from beneath the drain. I froze with my hands slick with chlorine, straining to listen, convinced it was a trick of the pipes. Yet the longer I stood, the clearer it grew. The sound had a rhythm, a chorus of agony rising and falling beneath the mechanical thunder. It wasn't one voice. It was many. And they weren't distant. They were directly under my feet, trapped where no space existed, where the schematics of the ship swore there was only steel. I shut off the pumps, heart slamming against my ribs, and the screams died instantly, cut off mid-breath. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, like the pool itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to do the same. I leaned over the drain, the gaping metal eye at the bottom of the basin, and felt a rush of air against my face. Warm, wet, as if something had exhaled. When the pumps roared back to life, the screams returned with them, rawer now, pressing harder against the steel, echoing through the water, until it seemed the whole pool vibrated with their grief. My stomach turned. I stumbled back from the edge, tools clattering to the deck, and I told myself I imagined it. That was easier. That was safer. But the truth of that night never left me. It was stitched into the silence between the engines, burned into the hiss of chlorine. For every time I drained the pool after that, I swore the voices grew sharper, closer, as though the drain was thinning, weakening, like a wall between two worlds wearing thin. And when the tourists floated lazily above it by day, laughing, sunburnt, sipping watered cocktails, I could not help but wonder if they knew what stirred beneath them. No one believes me when I say the water remembers. That sometimes, in the roar of the pumps, the ship itself screams. But I heard it. I still hear it. And each night, as I step onto that deck alone, I know the pool is waiting. For the last seal to break. For the last barrier to give way. So that whatever writhes below can finally claw its way through. The next night, I came prepared, convincing myself the screams had been nothing more than a trick of fatigue, the groan of metal echoing through water, my imagination gnawing on shadows. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Every step across the deserted pool deck felt heavier, the silence pressing like a hand on my chest. I kept telling myself it was a prank, some cruel joke by other crew who knew how easy it was to let the ocean twist your thoughts. And I almost believed it until I pulled the filter. The pump wheezed as I unscrewed the grate, the smell of chlorine burning my nostrils. Normally, the filter caught nothing worse than leaves, hair, the occasional scrap of paper. But that night, what came free made my hands go numb. Tangled between the wires were strands of fabric, ripped and shredded, woven tight with something stringy and dark. I tugged, expecting to feel slime or seaweed, but what slipped into my palm was heavier. It was cloth, soaked through, sticky. At first, I thought it was a towel someone had shoved into the drain, until I turned it in the weak glow of my work light and saw the color. Not the bright sting of chlorine, not the faint green of algae. This was darker, rusty, brown-black, the unmistakable shade of something old and human. Blood. I dropped it without meaning to, the wet slap of the fabric hitting the deck louder than it should have been. My heart kicked in my throat, every hair on my arms lifting as I stared at the twisted strands. They weren't just rags. They were scraps of clothing. The pattern of stitching was clear in places, seams torn by force, threads frayed and curling. And clinging to it, so faint it might have been missed, were tiny fibers of something paler, hair or worse, flesh, softened and eaten away by chemicals. I wanted to tell myself it had come from luggage, that someone had lost a bag overboard and the filters had chewed up its contents. But deep inside I knew better. This was no stray cloth, no accident. The way the screams had echoed the night before, rising from the very pipes I was now elbow deep in, left no room for coincidence. Whatever I held had been worn by someone who had screamed. I shoved the scraps into a trash bag and tied it off tight, hiding it among the rest of the waste to be burned later. My hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped my wrench as I reassembled the grate. Every second I lingered on that deck, I expected to hear the voices again, to see a pale hand thrust up through the drain, clawing at the tiles. By the time I finished, dawn was spilling across the water, turning the surface of the pool gold and calm, erasing the horror like it had never happened. But when passengers arrived hours later, laughing as they dove in, I could not look at the water the same way. All I could see was fabric, blood, and the echo of screams still trapped beneath the surface, waiting to be heard again. I tried to keep myself away from the pool after that. I traded shifts, lingered in the engine room longer than necessary, volunteered for any job that pulled me far from that humming deck. But avoidance never works. On a ship, everything circles back eventually. And when it did, it came for me in the darkest hours. It was 2 a.m. when I found myself back there, called up by a supervisor who claimed the pump alarms were misfiring again. The deck was deserted, the moonlight stretched across the tiles like a pale stain, and the pool itself lay still as glass. I walked toward it slowly, my tools rattling in the silence, and that's when I saw her. The pool on the upper deck had a glass bottom, a design meant for spectacle. In daylight, it looked out over the promenade below, a crystal trick to make tourists marvel. But that night, when I glanced down through it, there was no promenade, no carpet, no lights, only water. Black water, stretching endlessly below like the ship was suspended over some drowned abyss. And pressed against the glass from beneath was a face. She was young, no older than the passengers' children I saw each day splashing in the shallow end. Her hair floated around her head in a cloud of dark strands, twisting as though caught in some deep current. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, filled with something worse than fear. They were pleading. Her mouth opened and closed against the glass, bubbles curling from her lips, though I knew there was no air to breathe. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on the edge of the deck. My first thought was that someone had drowned, that somehow she'd been trapped inside the pipes, dragged beneath by suction. But that was impossible. The pool had been drained earlier. There was no way water should be beneath the glass, no way she could even be there. Yet as I stood frozen, she lifted her hands, slamming them flat against the pane with a sound that cracked through the silence. A hollow, wet smack that echoed like a heartbeat. Her nails scraped across the glass, leaving pale trails, and I swear I felt the vibration run up through the soles of my shoes. The black water swirled thicker behind her, shapes moving in it. Arms, shoulders, silhouettes pressing closer, surrounding her as if dragging her down. Her face twisted, eyes rolling back until only the whites stared at me. And then she was yanked into the dark, vanishing in a swirl of bubbles that rose and burst against the underside of the glass. The pool above looked unchanged, clear, empty. The calm surface rippled once, then lay still again. I ran. I didn't even bother shutting the alarms off. My tools clattered to the tiles, abandoned. And even as I fled down the corridor, my ears rang with the sound of her palms slamming against that glass, each strike echoing like she was still trying, even now, to break through. I didn't sleep after that night. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. My ears still rang with the sound of those palms against the glass. By morning, I forced myself to report it, dragging the words out like they were stones lodged in my throat. The managers listened politely, nodding in the stiff way people do when they're already rehearsing how to dismiss you. When I told them about the girl beneath the pool, about the black water, about the faces pressing against the glass, their expressions didn't shift. They only said it was impossible. One of them, a man with the kind of voice that cuts like a blade, told me bluntly that the pool had no lower chamber, no access, no hidden reservoir, nothing but reinforced steel supporting the glass. "You saw reflection," he said. "You saw shadows. Don't let the night play tricks on you." His certainty was worse than mockery. It was final, like a door slamming shut. But the words curdled in me. I knew what I had seen. I had looked down through that glass and watched a girl's face flatten against it. Had watched her hair float in water that was not supposed to exist. Steel could not breathe against my ear. Steel could not scream. They told me to take a few nights off, to get rest, to stop working so many shifts. I agreed, but not because I believed them. I just wanted to escape the room where their smiles looked too rehearsed, too relieved, as though my story was not the first they had heard. They weren't surprised. They were covering. That evening, when the ship quieted and the decks filled with laughter again, I returned to the pool. I needed proof. I needed to peel back their lies with my own hands. I tapped the tiles, pressed along the seams, crouched low, and rapped my knuckles against the underside panels. They rang hollow. Not the heavy thud of steel, but something deeper, a resonance that vibrated faintly through my bones. I pressed my ear to the floor, ignoring the stares of passing staff. And for a moment, just beneath the mechanical groan of pumps, I thought I heard it again. A soft echo, too faint to be anything ordinary. A gasp, a whisper, a plea. When I straightened, my reflection stared back at me from the surface of the water. But not just mine. Another shadow hovered beside me, taller, blurred, standing so close our shoulders nearly touched. I spun around. The deck was empty. Steel, they told me. Nothing but steel. Yet the truth was seeping through cracks they refused to acknowledge. The pool was not what it seemed. The voices weren't tricks. The fabric wasn't debris. The girl wasn't a reflection. Something was living beneath, pressed against a skin of glass and metal, desperate to be heard. And if management kept insisting otherwise, it wasn't because they believed the lie. It was because they feared the truth far more than I did. I tried to bury it, to fold the memory away like a uniform at the end of a shift. But the ship never lets you forget. Work drags you back into the same corners, the same decks, the same cursed routines. And every time my schedule pulled me up to the pool again, I felt the weight of her waiting. By then, I knew better than to speak about it. Management had made it clear, steel and glass, nothing else. But when the pumps roared to life, their lies cracked wide open. The sound came like clockwork. First the mechanical churn, then the hiss of suction, and then, layered beneath it, the screaming. Hers. It started low, muffled, like someone pressed deep in water. And then it rose, twisting through the pipes, growing until I couldn't tell if it was outside me or inside my skull. Her voice tore at the machinery's roar, begging, pleading, the syllables garbled, but the desperation unmistakable. I knelt by the drain, tools clattering uselessly on the tiles, and for a moment it felt like the suction wasn't pulling water at all, but pulling at me. The grate vibrated under my palms, rattling against its bolts as though something beneath clawed at it, shaking, testing for weakness. And when I pressed my ear close, I could hear her. Not just the scream, but words trying to form, straining against the barrier. The only thing I understood, the only thing that came clear, was a single command. Open. I should have fled. Every instinct screamed at me to leave the deck, to run until the ocean was nothing but a smear on the horizon. But I stayed, frozen, staring at that dark eye of the drain, while my breath fogged the air. The water swirled harder, as if stirred by unseen hands below. I could almost see her there, hair streaming upward, hands locked around the grate, her eyes rolling back as she strained to pull it free. Once, the bolts actually shifted. I heard the metal creak. That was the night I realized the drain wasn't just a trap. It was a door. And she wasn't begging for rescue. She was demanding release. I stopped touching the tools after that. I'd leave the filter clogged, the pipes screaming, anything to keep from loosening a single screw. But the truth is, it doesn't matter anymore. I hear her in every voyage, no matter the ship, no matter the waters. That scream rides the pumps like it's tethered to me, bleeding into my nights, dripping into my bones. Still, she pulls. Still, she begs. And one night, when my hands are too tired, when my mind slips, when my fear buckles into pity, I know I will obey. I will open that drain, and whatever waits behind it will not come alone. The pool is only the first mouth. The sea has many more, and once they are open, nothing on this ship will ever be clean again. The lower decks always carried a kind of heaviness, the air thicker, the lights dimmer, the hum of the engines vibrating through the bones of the ship. I had walked those corridors 100 times during cleaning rounds, doors lined neatly like teeth, brass numbers glinting under the dull glow of ceiling lamps. But that night, one door caught me. The plaque read 374. It was marked as vacant on my roster, yet the moment I reached for the handle, I knew something was wrong. The air around me was stifling, hot and stale, the kind of breathless heat that sticks clothes to your skin. But the handle was cold, not cool metal against warm fingers. Cold, icy, so cold that frost seemed to burn against my skin as if it had been left out on deck under the night sky. I pulled back quickly, staring at my palm, half expecting it to steam. I frowned and checked the manifest again. Vacant. No passengers assigned, no cleaning required. I should have moved on, but I didn't. Something about that door felt like it had been waiting for me. The corridor around me seemed quieter, too quiet for a living ship. And the longer I stood there, the more I realized I could not hear the distant thump of music, the shuffle of guests, the usual background noise. There was only the hum of the lights and the low growl of engines beneath my feet. I knocked gently. The sound echoed strangely, hollow, as if the cabin was not a room at all, but some vast chamber stretching beyond what should exist. No answer came, of course, only that empty ring of knuckles against wood. Still, my skin prickled with the sensation that something inside had noticed. I should have left then, crossed the hall and moved on with my cart. But curiosity rooted me there. I leaned closer, pressing my ear to the door, and for a second, I thought I heard something faint on the other side. Not movement, not breathing, just a low, rhythmic pulse, like a heart beating against the walls. I whispered the cabin number to myself, 374, like a charm to break the spell. And the handle gave the faintest tremor under my hand, as though whatever was inside had pressed against it from the other side. I pulled away fast, my throat dry, and hurried down the corridor with my cart rattling too loudly in the silence. Yet as I turned the corner, I glanced back. The door was exactly as it had been. Shut, still brass number gleaming. But in that dull light, for the briefest moment, I swore I saw frost creeping outward across the wood, thin veins of ice blooming in the heat, only to vanish as quickly as they came. Vacant, they said. No passengers, no cleaning required. And yet cabin 374 waited, patient, silent, its frozen handle daring me to return. The next night, I couldn't keep away. Every step of my rounds drew me closer to that door, my cartwheels squeaking against the floor like they too resisted the silence of that corridor. Cabin 374 waited where I had left it, brass number dull in the dim light, handle pale with its unnatural chill. My hands shook as I slid the master key into the lock. The tumblers clicked, the door creaked, and a breath of air met me. Wet, heavy, wrong. Inside, the room looked ordinary at first glance. The bed was made with military precision, the sheets crisp, corners tucked. The mirror gleamed spotless, reflecting only the pale oval of my frightened face. The carpet was vacuumed, the desk bare. It was a model of order, untouched, lifeless. But then my eyes caught the walls. Moisture beaded across the wallpaper, dripping in fat rivulets down to the floor. Patches were slick and dark, the dampness spreading in uneven patterns like a shadow that had pressed itself against the surface for too long. I stepped closer, reaching out without meaning to, and my fingertips came away wet. It wasn't the soft humidity of ocean air. It was clammy, warm, and it clung to my skin as though it wanted to sink deeper. The strangest part wasn't the dampness. It was the feeling that the walls had exhaled, that every drop of condensation wasn't from some broken pipe or faulty ventilation, but from breath. Deep, ragged, unrelenting breath, as though the very room had lungs that had been working furiously long before I opened the door. I listened. Beneath the hum of the ship, I could hear it. A faint rhythm, like the rise and fall of air drawn through a throat. Slow, deliberate. Inhale, exhale, the cadence of something aware of me now. Something that had paused when I entered, but hadn't stopped entirely. My heart slammed in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was machinery, that heat and cold had met in the steel bones of the cabin and birthed condensation. But no machine breathes like that. No machine pauses mid-inhale when you whisper into the air. I moved toward the mirror, trying to anchor myself in its clean surface. But the reflection unsettled me further. The room looked the same, yet the streaks on the walls behind my reflection shifted, curling like fingers dragging down glass. I spun, but the damp remained still. Motionless, innocent. Only in the mirror did it appear to crawl. I backed away, nearly stumbling over my own cart. The walls pulsed faintly, the beads of moisture quivering as though stirred by some movement deep within the structure itself. My instincts screamed at me to leave, and for once, I listened. I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling too violently to slot the key at first. When it finally clicked shut, the corridor's hot, stale air felt like a relief. Yet I knew I hadn't been alone in there. Something had been breathing, and the room itself seemed to ache with the effort of holding it in. I told myself I would not return, that I had seen enough. I forced the memory of those damp walls into the back of my mind, buried it beneath chores and meaningless chatter with other crew. But the ship is patient. It waits until the quiet hours, when the corridors are empty and your thoughts are louder than your footsteps. That's when it came back for me. I had locked the door to 374 myself, felt the tumblers slide into place, pressed the handle until I was certain it would not turn. Yet later, as the ship creaked in its endless sway, I heard it. A sound that froze me mid-step in the corridor. A cough. It wasn't the polite clear of a throat or the ragged rasp of an old smoker. It was wet, thick, like lungs filled with water or phlegm, each hack rattling through the walls with a sickly weight. I stopped, holding my breath, my cart silent before me. The cough came again, muffled but close, too close. It came from behind the door I had sealed hours before. Then came footsteps, slow at first, measured, pacing, back and forth across the carpet I had left pristine. The weight of each step carried through the steel beneath my feet, steady as a heartbeat. The rhythm unsettled me more than the cough. It wasn't the restless shuffling of someone lost or sick. It was deliberate, as though whoever was inside knew I was listening and wanted me to hear them trace the length of the room again and again. I leaned closer without meaning to, my ear nearly pressing to the door. And the cough returned. Louder, harsher, as if the figure had stopped directly on the other side. The sound sprayed against the wood, a bubbling choke that made me stumble back with my stomach lurching. I looked up and down the corridor, hoping someone else had heard it. But there was only silence and the stale, suffocating air. The lights buzzed faintly overhead, flickering once, and in that momentary dimming, the cough became a laugh. Brief, guttural, wrong. My hand hovered over the key at my belt, trembling. Part of me needed to open the door, to prove it was empty, to prove the damp walls and the breathing had been tricks of fatigue. But another part, older, deeper, primal, knew that if I slid that key into the lock, the coughing would stop, and something else would be waiting on the other side, standing perfectly still in the silence, smiling. I forced myself away, pushing my cart faster, eyes fixed on the end of the corridor. But even as I turned the corner, the sounds followed. Footsteps pacing, coughs racking, the occasional scrape of fingernails against wood. The cabin was not vacant, not anymore. Something had moved in, and it wanted me to know it was awake. By morning, I had convinced myself that proof would set me free. Proof that what I heard, the coughing, the pacing, had a logical explanation. So I went to security, bleary-eyed, clutching my roster sheet with the cabin number circled in trembling pen. I asked them about 374, about who was lodged there, about why it had been marked vacant but wasn't. They looked at me strangely, like I had asked the shape of a shadow. One officer pulled up the ship's blueprint on his monitor. I leaned close, my pulse quickening as the schematic unfolded, each deck stacked in neat blue lines, every corridor and cabin marked in precise detail. He scrolled to the section where I had been the night before, the very hallway I had walked, the brass numbers gleaming under flickering lights. But when his cursor slid across the deck, my stomach dropped. Cabin 374 was not there. The map showed the corridor, yes. The neighboring cabins, perfectly aligned. But where I knew the door had been, where I had turned the handle and stepped inside to feel the damp walls breathing around me, there was nothing. A blank stretch of wall. No door, no room, no space accounted for at all. I argued, stammering, insisting they had the wrong file. They pulled another schematic, older this time, then another, each more yellowed and digitalized than the last. None of them bore the number 374. The ship's records claimed no such cabin had ever been built into the structure. Their faces hardened the more I pressed. Finally, one of them leaned forward, his voice low, controlled, almost warning. I don't know what you think you saw, but if you value your contract, you'll stop asking about it. He tapped the blueprint with one thick finger, right where the phantom door should have been. That's solid steel, always has been. I left the office with my skin crawling, my hands damp with sweat. I told myself they were lying, that they knew more than they let on. But a darker thought crept in, one I couldn't shake. What if the blueprint was right? What if no cabin existed at all, yet something had made a space for itself anyway? That night, I returned to the corridor, unable to stop myself. My breath caught when I saw it. The door was still there. Brass numbers shining faintly, handle pale with its frozen bite, exactly where it had always been, nestled between two cabins that should have stood flush against each other. I pressed my palm against the wall beside it, and the blueprint's truth hummed through my bones. The steel was cold, unbroken. Yet when I slid my hand to the door, the chill deepened, burrowing into me like a fever in reverse. The blueprints might deny it, the officers might erase it. But 374 was real, and it was never meant to be part of the ship. Something had built it anyway. Something that wanted to be housed. Something that wanted to be found. I should have thrown the key into the sea. That would have been the sensible thing, the safe thing. To watch it sink into the black water and vanish where it could never be used again. But I didn't. It sits in my pocket still, its teeth worn smooth from my fingers. Its cold weight a constant reminder. I tell myself I keep it as proof, a tether to the truth of what I saw. But the truth is darker. The truth is that the key wants to stay with me. Nights pass, voyages end, passengers come and go, yet the cabin never leaves. Sometimes I avoid that corridor for weeks, swearing I will not look. But eventually my rounds drag me back, and the door is always waiting. Brass number 374 gleaming faintly, the handle pale with frost, daring me to touch it again. And when the ship is quietest, when the laughter from the bars has died and only the groan of the ocean fills the dark, I hear it. Scratching. Faint at first, like nails dragged lazily across the wood, then sharper, hungrier, digging at the inside of the door. It comes in bursts, frantic, as though something trapped inside is clawing to be free. Sometimes it changes. Sometimes it isn't scratching, but tapping, rhythmic, measured like knuckles on wood. A knock that waits for an answer. A knock that matches my own heartbeat until I cannot tell which sound belongs to me. I press my palm against the key in my pocket when it happens, gripping it so tightly the ridges cut into my skin. The metal always feels colder in those moments, as if it has been dipped in ice. It's as though the key itself is aware of the noise, aching to turn in the lock, begging me to obey. I think about what waits behind that door, the damp walls, the sound of lungs dragging in thick, wet air. The cough that became a laugh, the pacing footsteps that knew I was there. And worse, the blueprints that claimed no cabin existed at all. If I turn that key again, I will not just open a door. I will open something that should never have been built, never have been housed within steel and wood. Yet still, in the silence, I feel it pressing, begging, whispering through the seams. It wants out. It wants the corridors, the halls, the sleeping passengers who shuffle past unaware. And sometimes, when exhaustion blurs the edges of my thoughts, I wonder if I will give in. Not out of fear, but out of pity. Because whatever is inside has been scratching for so long, and the sound has grown desperate. So I carry the key. I carry it knowing that one night, perhaps on a voyage when no one will miss me, when the halls are empty and the ship rocks in endless black, I might slip it into the lock. And when I do, whatever has been caged in 374 will finally step into the halls, free at last, wearing a smile that was waiting just for me. Most people think of a cruise ship as a floating city of lights, music, and laughter. They never wonder what waits beneath all that glitter, far below the decks where no passenger sets foot. But I know. Every ship has a morgue, a fact no brochure mentions, a truth tucked away like an unwanted memory. My job was simple, or so they told me. Escort the bodies down when illness, accidents, or heart failure claim them. People die at sea more often than you'd think. And the ocean is patient, swallowing secrets without question. The morgue was deep below, past the storage decks, through narrow hallways where the air grew colder, staler. I would walk behind the covered stretcher, wheels rattling over steel grates, fluorescent lights flickering above. No music reached there, no laughter, only the hum of the engines and the faint echo of my own footsteps. By the time we reached the door, I always felt like the ship itself was holding its breath. The room was small, lined with stainless steel drawers and a few cold lockers. A sterile place, though it never felt clean. The chill bit harder than the air outside should allow, seeping into your bones no matter how long you stayed. I tried not to look too closely at the bags we slid inside, tried not to notice the shapes, the stillness. I told myself it was just part of the job, the same as scrubbing decks or checking lifeboats. But the truth weighed on me. Each body had been laughing, eating, drinking hours before. They'd been leaning on railings, watching sunsets, never knowing their last voyage had already begun. Now they were zipped into silence, placed on shelves like forgotten luggage until we reached shore. The first time I escorted one down alone, I kept my eyes fixed on the door ahead, pushing the stretcher slowly as though any sudden movement might disturb the stillness inside. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though the hallway was empty. My ears filled with phantom sounds, the whisper of fabric shifting, the creak of leather straps, the faintest scrape as though fingers brushed against the inside of the bag. I forced myself to ignore it, to focus on the cold metal handle of the morgue door. Still, when I slid the stretcher in and locked the drawer, I could have sworn I heard an exhale. Long, ragged, fogging the plastic from within. It was easier to laugh it off, to call it trapped air, to remind myself that the body was only that, a body. But as I climbed the stairs back to the world of music and lights, I couldn't shake the weight pressing on me. Passengers danced above, sipping wine, filling the air with their voices, while below, the dead waited in silence. And I, their escort, could never forget that in every voyage, paradise rode on top of a morgue. What I didn't know then was that silence does not last. Bodies may rest, but not all of them stay still. It was late, the corridors hollow and still, when they called me down for transfer. 3 bodies, all brought in from different parts of the ship within hours of each other. 2 from sudden heart failure, 1 from a fall. The stretcher wheels groaned under the weight as I guided them through the narrow passageways, the plastic of the bags catching the fluorescent light in dull reflections. I tried not to think of what was inside, tried to let the cold numbness of routine carry me forward. But routine doesn't save you when something shifts. The first 2 bags lay silent, their forms stiff and unforgiving. But the third unsettled me. Its weight seemed uneven, almost fluid, as if whatever was inside hadn't settled properly. I forced the thought away, muttering to myself, counting the steps to the morgue door. Still, my eyes drifted to the faint outline of the face beneath the plastic, blurred but unmistakable. And then it happened. As I leaned to straighten the stretcher, the bag stirred, just slightly, almost imperceptible, the plastic tightening and slackening like lungs pulling against it. I froze, the sound of my own breath catching in my throat. Then came the exhale, slow, ragged, unmistakably human. Warm condensation spread across the plastic near where the mouth should have been, fog blooming outward in a trembling oval. My knees nearly buckled. I gripped the edge of the stretcher so hard my fingers ached, eyes fixed on that expanding patch of mist. Every part of me screamed to unzip it, to make sure, to prove that what I'd seen wasn't real. But another part, older and sharper, held me back. Because if it wasn't air trapped in the bag, if it truly was a breath, then unsealing it meant facing whatever had drawn it. The corridor was silent but for the hum of the engines below. And yet I felt watched. Not by eyes, but by the weight of the air itself. I swallowed hard, forcing the stretcher forward, refusing to look at the fogged plastic even as it lingered longer than it should have. By the time I shoved them into their drawers, my hands were slick with sweat despite the cold. The first 2 bodies slid inside with no trouble, lifeless as expected. But when I came to the third, the drawer seemed to resist. I pushed harder, my muscles straining, and for an instant, it felt as though the bag pushed back from the inside. When I finally locked it shut, my breath came in harsh gasps. I told myself it was nothing. Air pockets, pressure changes, tricks of exhaustion. But as I turned to leave, I glanced back once more. On the inside of the locker's glass panel, faint but visible, was a smear shaped like a hand. Fingers splayed wide, pressed from within. I left the morgue with my ears ringing, each step echoing like a heartbeat. And I knew, trapped air does not press its palm against the glass. The image of that fogged patch on the plastic clung to me for days, haunting every step I took on the lower decks. I repeated the lie to myself whenever it crept into my mind. Trapped air, condensation, nothing more. A body is just a body. But the ship has a way of stripping lies bare, especially in the hours when everyone else is asleep, and the hum of the engines feels like it's pulsing through your veins. It was during one of those nights that I went back down, called to check on the storage. The morgue always felt colder than it should, the kind of cold that seeps beneath your uniform and settles deep in your bones. I wheeled open the drawers one by one, my breath puffing white in the stagnant air. The first 2 bodies lay still, their bags untouched. But when I came to the third, the one that had exhaled, I felt my stomach tighten. The plastic was stretched taut in places, as though the body inside had shifted. I leaned closer, squinting in the weak light. That's when it happened. The bag moved. It wasn't the settling of weight, not the innocent slump of a corpse adjusting in its stillness. This was deliberate. The torso rose, pressing upward, the zipper straining as if something beneath it was trying to sit up. The sound was soft but unmistakable. The metal teeth of the zipper grinding, the plastic creasing under sudden force. I stumbled back, my shoulders slamming against the steel drawers behind me. My mind screamed for logic, for reason. Gases, I told myself. Bodies release gases. They bloat. They shift. But no gas could arch a spine. No chemical release could press that hard against a sealed bag until it looked ready to burst open. The movement stopped as suddenly as it had started. The form sank back down, limp once more, plastic fluttering faintly in the cold air. I stood frozen, every nerve alight, my breath shallow. Then, in the silence, came a faint sound. A scrape, like nails dragging slowly against the inside of the bag. One long pull, then another. I backed toward the door, my eyes never leaving the drawer. The scrape stopped, replaced by a stillness so deep it seemed the entire room was holding its breath. I nearly convinced myself it had been my imagination, a trick of exhaustion, until the zipper twitched. Just slightly, a tiny jerk, as though fingers were fumbling with it from the inside. That was enough. I fled, slamming the door behind me, my footsteps echoing through the deserted corridor. Yet even as I climbed the stairs back toward the decks where music still played, I couldn't shake the image burned into my mind. The zipper straining, teeth grinding as if at any moment it might part. And whatever lay inside would rise to meet me in the cold silence of the morgue. I didn't dare open the drawer again. Whatever pressed against that zipper wanted to be seen, wanted to be freed, and I knew if I laid eyes on it, I wouldn't come back the same. So I did the only thing I could. I left. I shut the morgue door tight, locked it with shaking hands, and climbed the endless stairs back to the upper decks. The air was warmer there, thick with perfume and spilled liquor, with laughter and the dizzying music of midnight parties. It felt unreal, like stepping into another world, as though the cold place below belonged to a different ship entirely. I tried to forget, but the memory stayed with me, humming like a current beneath my skin. Every creak of the walls, every shudder of the engines reminded me of that shifting bag, of the zipper straining against unseen hands. I avoided the lower decks the rest of the night, pacing the corridors, listening to my own thoughts louder than the footsteps of drunken passengers stumbling toward their cabins. Sleep never came. When dawn finally broke and my shift returned me below, the morgue was silent, colder than ever. I braced myself, the key heavy in my palm, and opened the door. The room was empty. The drawers that had held the 3 zipped bags stood bare, pulled open like mouths frozen in a silent scream. No stretchers, no bodies. Nothing but the sterile gleam of metal and the faint mist of my own breath in the chill. I checked the logs, flipping through pages that should have contained names, times, causes of death. Blank. No entries for the night before. No record of 3 sudden deaths. No evidence that anyone had ever been brought down at all. The paperwork had been erased, scrubbed clean, as if those passengers had never existed. I asked the officers, though I already knew what their answer would be. They looked at me with practiced calm, the kind of expressions worn smooth from years of repetition. No such deaths, they said. No such bodies. No such transfer last night. Perhaps I had misremembered. Perhaps I had dreamed it. Perhaps I was overworked, fatigued, mistaken. But I wasn't mistaken. I could still feel the condensation of breath fogging plastic. Still hear the scrape of nails on the inside of the bag. Still see the zipper twitch like a mouth trying to open. 3 bodies had come aboard with me. I had rolled them through those corridors. I had placed them in those drawers, and now they were gone. I told myself they had been moved, hidden, transferred elsewhere. But the deeper truth clawed its way into my thoughts and never left. They weren't moved. They weren't taken. They had gotten up. I left the morgue with my heart hammering, the weight of the silence pressing against my back. Above me, sunlight glittered across the sea as passengers stretched and smiled, unaware that in the dark belly of the ship, something had risen in the night and walked free without leaving a trace. I stopped asking questions after that night. What good were questions when every answer came back clean and polished, rehearsed until it sounded like truth? The morgue was empty, the logs erased, and yet I carried the memory of those bags shifting, the zippers straining, the faint fog of breath blooming against plastic. No one believed me, but I didn't need them to. The ship itself gave me proof. It began at port. Dawn lights spilling over the docks, passengers gathering their luggage in messy excitement, laughing and waving as they shuffled down the gangway. At first, it all looked normal. Families, couples, retirees, all spilling into the waiting world beyond. But then I saw them, pale shapes moving among the crowd. Not quite passengers, though they wore the same clothes. Not quite living, though they walked with the same hurried steps. Their skin was waxy, stretched too thin, with a hue that no sunlight could ever warm. Their eyes never met mine, never seemed to focus on anything at all. But their movements were steady, deliberate, weaving through the others unnoticed. No staff stopped them. No customs agent checked their names. They bore no luggage, no tags, no record of belonging to the manifest. They slipped down the gangway like shadows breaking from the hull, unmarked, unclaimed. I stood frozen the first time I saw them, my mouth dry as dust, watching one after another step onto the dock. I recognized the curve of a shoulder, the tilt of a head. I knew those outlines. They were the ones I had rolled through the corridors. The ones zipped into silence. The ones who had exhaled when no lungs should have moved. The crowd swallowed them quickly, the sea of tourists laughing and shouting, calling taxis, waving to locals. But if you kept your eyes sharp, you could see it. The pale figures drifting further from the crowd, slipping into alleys, into side streets, into the city beyond. And once they were gone, they did not return. Every docking since, I have watched for them, and every time they are there. Different faces, different shapes, but always the same waxen pallor, the same empty eyes. They blend in just enough to go unnoticed by the living. But I see them. I always see them. I've stopped sleeping on nights before port. I find myself standing by the rails, staring at the gangway as the ship eases into harbor. My hands clench the metal so tight it bites into my palms. I wonder how many are walking among us now, scattered through cities across the world, carrying with them the silence of the morgue. The dead do not stay in their drawers. They do not stay in their bags. They walk. They pass among the living, unnoticed. No one ever thinks to count them. And me? I have become their witness, cursed to watch as they leave, voyage after voyage. The morgue takes them in, the gangway sets them free, and I know one day, in some port I've never seen before, one of those pale shapes will stop, turn its head, and look back for me. The staff elevator was nothing like the smooth, polished lifts the passengers used. Their elevators shone with mirrors and gold trim, music humming softly through hidden speakers. Ours was a rattling steel cage bolted into the ship's spine, a groaning contraption that carried trays from the kitchens, crates of supplies, and the crew who had no other choice. It smelled of grease and damp iron, the kind of air that clung to your clothes long after you stepped out. Every time I entered, the walls shuddered as though the elevator itself resented being woken. It ran straight down into the hidden decks, the places guests never knew existed. There were entire levels down there, storage rooms, maintenance corridors, forgotten chambers swallowed by steel that didn't appear on maps or brochures. The elevator was our only lifeline between the glittering world above and the humming belly below. And though I hated it, orders were orders. The first time I rode it alone, I pressed the button and felt the floor lurch violently beneath me. The doors clanged shut with a sound like a prison gate, and the cage began its descent. The lights flickered, buzzing weakly overhead, shadows trembling across the grated walls. I counted the seconds, whispering to myself, willing the ride to end quickly. Halfway down, the elevator always paused. Just for a second, no more. A stutter in the gears, a long breath between movements. But in that pause, when the ship's hum surrounded you and the cage swayed like a pendulum, you could swear someone else was inside with you. I'd feel it in the way the air thickened, heavy with a presence that wasn't mine. Once, I even caught a faint whisper, a sound that slithered into my ear and vanished the moment the lift shuddered to life again. The others joked about it, of course. They said the elevator was haunted by some cook who got caught in its gears decades ago, or by stowaways crushed in the shaft. I laughed along, but my laughter was hollow, because the elevator had no need of stories to unsettle me. It was enough just to ride it, to hear the chains groan and the cables shriek, to feel the walls closing in as if the ship itself meant to swallow me whole. Still, I had no choice. The kitchens demanded supplies, and supervisors demanded obedience. Night after night, I stepped into that cage, pressed the button, and prayed for the doors to open again on solid ground. And every time, as the elevator rattled down into the dark, I felt the same thing, that I wasn't descending alone, that something unseen was pacing just beyond the flickering light, waiting for me to acknowledge it. Orders were orders. But even then, before the worst of it began, I knew one truth with cold certainty. No one rides the staff elevator without leaving part of themselves behind. It was past midnight, and they sent me down with a cart of supplies. The ship above still pulsed with music and laughter, but below, in the staff halls, the silence was suffocating. I wheeled the cart into the staff elevator, pressed the button for the lowest deck, and braced myself for the ride I had come to dread. The doors clanged shut, the cage shuddered, and with a groan of cables, the descent began. Halfway down, the familiar pause came. That stuttering moment when the machinery seemed to hold its breath. But this time, the pause lingered too long. The cage jerked, then froze, dangling in the shaft. The lights flickered once, twice, the bulb overhead buzzing as shadows flinched across the steel. I pressed the emergency button, but the speaker only hissed, static filling the tiny space. My heartbeat filled my ears. The mirrored panel on the back wall caught my attention then. It wasn't there for vanity, just a small strip of polished steel, meant to give the illusion of space in the cramped box. Usually, it reflected only my own nervous figure, hunched over the cart. But in the sputtering light, I saw more. At first, it was subtle. My reflection blurred, stretched, like heat rising off asphalt. I leaned closer, squinting, and then I saw it clearly. Another shape, another me. It stood just behind my reflection, too close, shoulder almost brushing mine, though the cage was empty. The figure wore the same uniform, the same cap pulled low, but the face was wrong. Its eyes were open too wide, unblinking, pupils dilated into black pools that swallowed the rest. And the mouth, stitched shut with thick black cords, the skin around it torn and raw where the thread bit too deep. My breath hitched, fogging the steel. The figure in the reflection tilted its head slowly, unnaturally, like a marionette jerked by invisible strings. I spun, certain someone was behind me, but the cage was empty. Only the rattling chains above, only the shuddering silence. When I turned back, the reflection was still there. Its chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, though mine had stopped in terror. Each exhale fogged the mirrored steel, but the moisture spread across the glass on its side, not mine. I watched the cords at its mouth strain, threads quivering as though it wanted to speak, to scream, to tear them free. The lights flared then, blinding for a moment. And when they dimmed again, I was alone. My reflection was only mine, pale and shaking, eyes wide with fear. I backed against the doors, whispering prayers I hadn't spoken since childhood. The elevator groaned back to life, jolting so hard I nearly fell. When the doors finally clanged open onto the lower deck, I shoved the cart out and stumbled into the hall, my legs weak, my skin slick with sweat despite the chill. Still, even as I walked away, I felt it. the stitched mouth breathing against my neck, trapped in the glass, waiting for the next pause in the shaft to show itself again. I told myself I'd imagined it, that exhaustion had conjured shapes in the steel, shadows in the glass. But lies only work for so long, and the elevator has no patience for lies. A few nights later, I was called again. Another run to the lower decks, another cart heavy with crates. I hesitated, staring at the rattling cage as though it were a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. But orders were orders. I pushed the cart in, pressed the button, and the doors clanged shut with finality. The ride began like always, with its uneasy sway, its chains groaning above. My skin prickled, every nerve screaming for me to look anywhere but the mirrored strip on the back wall. Yet the harder I tried not to, the more my eyes dragged back to it. At first, I saw only myself, pale, tight-jawed, clutching the handle of the cart as though it could save me. Then the light flickered, and she appeared. She was standing beside my reflection, so close our shoulders nearly touched. Her uniform was the same as mine, down to the company patch on the sleeve, though her fabric was darkened with stains I didn't dare name. Her hands were pressed flat to the glass, palms splayed wide, as though she were trapped inside the mirror and trying desperately to push through. Her face. I'll never forget her face. Her eyes were wide, so wide they looked torn at the edges, pupils blown into black circles that swallowed the whites. They pleaded raw and desperate, like a drowning woman reaching for the surface. But her mouth, God, her mouth, was sewn shut with thick black cord. The threads cut deep into her lips, puckering them into a grotesque seal, the skin cracked and torn where she had tried to scream against the stitching. She shook her head violently, eyes locked on mine, tears streaming in streaks that seemed too dark, too thick. Her body trembled as though every muscle fought against the cords holding her silent. And in that shuddering silence, I realized the cage itself was filled with her muffled cries, faint vibrations trembling through the walls. Though no sound reached my ears, I staggered back, slamming against the home doors, my breath tearing out of me in broken gasps. My reflection mirrored me, wild-eyed and pale. Hers did not. She stayed pressed to the glass, hands sliding down as if she were sinking, eyes never breaking from mine, begging me to help, begging me to tear the cords free. The elevator jolted, the chain screamed, and the light flared to life again. She was gone. Only me, alone in the glass. My chest heaved, but I couldn't shake the heat of her palms, couldn't stop seeing the way her lips tore against those threads with every silent scream. When the doors opened, I stumbled out, nearly collapsing into the corridor. But even as the cage closed behind me, I could feel her there still, trapped in the mirrored steel, waiting for the next time the elevator stalled, for the next chance to show me her stitched mouth and her pleading eyes. The night after I saw her, I swore I would take the stairs, no matter how many flights, no matter how much the supervisors yelled. But the ship has a way of cornering you, and that night the orders came sharp. Use the staff elevator, get the supplies down fast, no excuses. My stomach turned as I wheeled the cart inside, the doors groaning closed behind me. The cage shuddered, chains creaked, and I pressed myself back against the wall, already bracing for what I knew was coming. The descent began, that awful sway rattling through the steel bones of the ship. The overhead light buzzed weakly, casting the reflection of my pale face against the mirrored strip. I told myself not to look. I told myself I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me afraid. But when the elevator lurched to its familiar halt between decks, the lights sputtered, dimmed, and died. The darkness was absolute. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me, filled with the damp smell of rust and salt. And then came the sound. Threads pulling tight, cords straining against flesh. The noise slithered around me in the dark, tugging at my ears. And I knew she was back. I could almost hear the muffled screams behind her sewn lips, feel her eyes burning into me from the glass I couldn't see. My hand shook as I fumbled for my lighter, anything to make a spark. Before I could flick it, the bulb above crackled to life again, throwing the cage into its harsh glow. She was gone. The mirrored steel showed only me, alone, trembling, pale with fear. My reflection stood rigid, cart handle clenched, white-knuckled, chest heaving. Relief crashed through me, but it was short-lived, because when I looked down, my heart stopped. Scattered across the floor at my feet lay the cords. Thick, black threads, tangled in a small heap, frayed at the ends as though they had been torn from flesh. A few strands were still damp, glistening as if they had been ripped free only moments before. I staggered back, pressing myself to the wall, shaking my head as if denial could erase them. But the cords stayed. They shifted slightly as the cage swayed, brushing against my boots like dead worms, like veins pulled from a body. The air smelled of iron now, sharp and coppery, filling my nose, coating the back of my throat. The elevator jolted and resumed its descent, the heap of cords sliding an inch across the grated floor, inching closer to me as though they weren't finished yet. I kicked them away, my breath ragged, eyes fixed on the mirror. Still only me staring back. Only me. When the doors opened, I nearly threw the cart into the corridor and bolted out. I didn't look back, but I could feel it. The cords weren't abandoned. They had been delivered, left in my care. And the next time the lights flickered, I knew she would return. Mouth no longer sealed, voice no longer bound. Whatever had been kept silent in that glass was loose now, and it had chosen me to hear what it had to say. I should have refused to ride it again. I should have gone to the captain, to the engineers, to anyone who would listen. But the ship runs on obedience, and obedience drags you back into the cage, whether you like it or not. So I keep stepping inside, keep pressing the buttons with a shaking hand, keep praying each time the doors close that this will be the last descent. And every time, the mirror waits for me. It no longer shows only her. At first, I thought the cords at my feet had been some cruel trick, some relic of madness left behind by the ship itself. But since that night, the reflection has changed. Now, whenever the light falters, the mirrored strip fills with faces. They wear the same uniform as me. Kitchen whites, stewards' jackets, stained aprons, the plain clothes of invisible workers who keep the ship running while passengers dance above. Their shoulders brush mine in the reflection, though I stand alone in the cage. Their eyes are wide and pleading, ringed in shadows of exhaustion, each one begging for release. And all of them, every single one, has a mouth sewn shut with black cords, lips torn raw where they've fought to scream. Sometimes it's a young man, cap pulled low, his stitched mouth trembling. Sometimes it's a woman older than me, her hair escaping the confines of her net, her eyes wet with tears. Once, it was a boy. I swear he couldn't have been more than 16. His uniform hanging loose on his too thin frame, cords biting into skin too fragile to hold them. They stand pressed against the glass, their hands flat, their throats heaving with words they cannot say. The cords shift whenever the elevator stalls. They quiver in the glass like something alive, vibrating with muffled voices straining to break free. And I know, God help me, I know. They want me to finish what began with her. They want me to cut the threads, to pull loose the stitches that have bound them in silence. The pile at my feet was not discarded. It was an offering, a set of tools. I've started to dread the moment the lights flicker. Not because of the faces, I've almost grown used to them, but because I'm terrified of what will happen if I ever give in. If I reach down, pick up those cords, and touch the glass, will the stitches unravel? Will their screams finally spill into the world, filling the shaft until the chains snap and the cage plunges into the dark? The ship does not care. The passengers above will never know. But I do. And I am running out of strength to resist their eyes, their silent pleas, their endless waiting. One day soon, when the elevator halts and the faces press close, I think I will break. I think I will reach for the cords. And when I do, the stitched mouths will open all at once, and whatever truth they've been gagged from speaking will pour into me like a tide that never recedes. On my first voyage, when I was still green and eager to prove myself, the older staff whispered his name as if it were part of the ship itself. Eduardo, a waiter who had worked the grand dining hall long before I ever stepped aboard. They told me he was quick with a tray, sharper with a smile, the kind of man who could carry 3 plates on each arm and still wink at the guests without spilling a drop. But one night, mid-shift during a lavish dinner service, Eduardo simply disappeared. The story was always told the same way. He walked through the swinging doors into the kitchen, carrying a tray of half-finished drinks, and he never came back out. The chefs never saw him. The dishwashers swore he hadn't passed them. The managers searched every corner of the galley, every dry store and freezer, every hallway leading out to the service decks. No Eduardo, just silence and the hiss of ovens. Passengers grew restless as the courses lagged, but the staff learned quickly to mask panic with smiles. They served and cleared and bowed as though nothing had happened, while beneath the surface, whispers spread like cracks in glass. By midnight, the ship's officers were involved. They checked the crew cabins, the muster stations, even the lifeboats. But Eduardo was gone, vanished as though the ship had swallowed him whole. The next morning, his uniform still hung neatly in his locker. His shoes sat beneath his bunk, polished. His name remained on the roster, unmarked, as though he might still walk in at any moment and pick up where he left off. But he never did. The official story, the one management stuck to, was that Eduardo had jumped overboard, though no one saw him fall and no body ever washed ashore. The sea kept its silence, and the passengers moved on, but the crew never forgot. They said his name in low voices, shared it with new hires like a warning. Don't get too comfortable, don't let the ship notice you, or you'll end up like Eduardo. When I heard the story, I laughed nervously, treating it like one of those old sailors' tales meant to spook the rookies. But the way their eyes lingered, the way they avoided the kitchen door when the hall was busy, told me it wasn't just a story to them. The ship had taken someone once, and it could take someone again. That night, I was assigned to shadow a senior waiter during dinner service, weaving between linen-draped tables, balancing silver trays heavy with wine and roasted meat. The lights glimmered off chandeliers, the room alive with clinking glasses and bursts of laughter. But every time I passed through the swinging doors into the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that the air was different there. Thicker, colder, as though the space remembered what it had swallowed. And as I carried my tray, I kept thinking about Eduardo stepping through the very same doorway, never to return, leaving only his name behind to echo in whispers. I told myself it was nonsense. The kind of myth old staff spun to haze the new ones, a way to remind us that the ship had teeth. Ghost stories to pass the hours, nothing more. But that was before the night I saw him. The dining hall was at its height, chandeliers burning bright, glasses chiming in layered music, waiters gliding between tables like dancers on a stage. I balanced my tray, head down, smile fixed, rehearsing the rhythm that was slowly becoming second nature. And then I froze. Out of the corner of my eye, a figure moved. He wasn't on the roster, wasn't in uniform like the rest of us. His clothes were outdated, the fabric loose at the seams, stained in places the light couldn't quite hide. His skin was pale, drained of color, his cheeks hollowed, his eyes sunk deep into sockets ringed dark like bruises. But he carried a tray, steady as if it weighed nothing, moving silently between the tables. The guests didn't notice him. Not one turned their head. They kept laughing, clinking forks, sipping wine, oblivious to the figure weaving past them. His movements were practiced, perfect, but mechanical, like someone performing a role long after the curtain should have fallen. I stared, breath caught, unable to move as he slipped closer. I knew his face from the old photographs I'd glimpsed in staff quarters, yellowed clippings taped to lockers as warnings. Eduardo. It was him, exactly as described, yet older somehow, drained of life. His eyes flicked toward me once, just once, and in that glance, I felt an emptiness so deep it hollowed me out. His lips didn't move, but I swear I heard him whisper, though the sound was only in my bones, not the air. I stumbled, my tray tilting, cutlery clattering to the carpet. Heads turned at me, passengers frowning, some muttering irritation. But no one saw him. No one noticed the pale waiter slipping between them, vanishing toward the swinging doors as if swallowed whole. I pushed after him, ignoring the glares, ignoring the senior waiter hissing at me to get back in line. The doors swung shut in my face, clanging with finality. When I burst through into the kitchen, breath ragged, the air was empty. Only the hiss of steam, the clang of pots, the bark of chefs. No Eduardo. No pale figure carrying a tray that should have slipped from his skeletal grip long ago. The others laughed when I stammered my excuse, said I had tripped, said I had been distracted. But in their eyes, I saw it. The recognition, the fear they tried to hide. They knew who I'd seen. They had seen him too once. That night, as I scrubbed dishes in silence, I felt him behind me in the steam. Tray balanced, steps measured. When I turned, there was nothing but shadows. Yet the echo of his presence clung to me, and I knew the stories weren't to scare me. They were to prepare me. Because Eduardo hadn't left the ship. Eduardo was still serving. I should have let him vanish into the kitchen, let the doors swing shut and bury the sight with the steam and noise. But curiosity, or perhaps something darker, dragged me forward. I pushed through the chaos of clattering pans and shouting cooks, eyes scanning for the pale figure with a tray balanced so effortlessly in his hands. The air smelled of garlic and charred meat, but beneath it, I caught something sour, like stagnant water. I saw him slip through a narrow doorway at the far end, the one that led into the dry pantry. The door swung gently on its hinges, as though inviting me in. No one else seemed to notice. My heart thundered as I crossed the kitchen, ignoring the voices snapping at me to get back to my station. I pressed my hand against the door and pushed. The pantry was cold and silent. Rows of shelves lined with jars and cans loomed around me, their labels peeling from damp air that shouldn't have been there. The light buzzed weakly, a sickly yellow that barely reached the corners. I expected to see him there, stiff-backed, tray in hand, eyes hollow. But the room was empty. Then the sound came, a sharp metallic clatter bouncing against the walls. I spun, pulse hammering. On the floor near the shelves lay silverware, forks and knives scattered in a small heap as though dropped by unseen hands. They shouldn't have been there. The pantry held no service cutlery, only stores. Yet there they were, shining in the faint light, one knife spinning lazily on its edge before settling flat. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It pressed against me, heavy, waiting. I crouched and reached toward the pile, but stopped when I saw the faint smear across one of the forks. Not food, not grease. Something darker, thicker, clinging to the metal like it had been pulled through flesh before falling here. I backed toward the door, every instinct screaming to leave. My breath misted faintly, though the pantry had no reason to be cold. Behind me, the shelves groaned, as though weight shifted against them. A jar rattled, fell, shattered across the floor, though nothing had touched it. I fled then, shoving the door open, stumbling back into the heat and noise of the kitchen. The chefs cursed as I bumped past them, but their words blurred, lost beneath the pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I was back in the dining hall, on the shake, and chandeliers blinding after the dim pantry, the laughter and clinking of glasses jarringly out of place after what I had seen. Still, the sound followed me. The faint echo of silverware clattering on tile, repeating in my head with every step. Eduardo hadn't just passed through. He had left something behind, a trace of his service in the silence. And I knew then that the pantry was more than a storeroom. It was where he waited, tray balanced in skeletal hands, silver ready to fall again when another fool decided to follow. The complaints started small, whispered in the kind of tones passengers use when they don't want to make a scene but feel compelled to say something. At first, it was nothing unusual. Wine too warm, bread too stale, a waiter who seemed inattentive. But then the words sharpened, and my blood turned to ice as I overheard them. A couple at table 7 said a thin man had served them, silent as stone. They claimed his hands brushed theirs as he set down the glasses, so cold it felt like touching metal left out in winter. Another group at table 12 whispered about a waiter who appeared from nowhere, offering wine without a word. They noticed his face only briefly. Drawn, hollow, his lips pressed tightly together as though he was holding back words. They asked where he'd gone, why he hadn't returned, and none of us could answer. I wanted to dismiss it as confusion, a trick of light and nerves in a crowded hall. But the complaints multiplied. Guests spoke of him in hushed voices, each description fitting too neatly. Thin, silent, eyes that didn't quite focus, hands like ice. They said he moved among them without being called, without appearing on the floor plans, slipping trays between tables before vanishing as though the ship itself had swallowed him back down. One woman grew pale as she described the way her glass fogged when he poured, as though his breath had touched it. Another insisted she heard cutlery clatter to the floor. But when she looked down, nothing was there. Only the faint impression of footprints wetting the carpet, leading toward the swinging doors. The managers brushed it off, offered apologies with tight smiles, promised better service. But in the back halls, the whispers spread fast. Eduardo was still working, still carrying his tray, still serving wine to guests who had no idea they were being tended by someone who hadn't drawn breath in years. I found myself watching the dining room more closely, scanning every uniform, every pale face under the chandeliers. My pulse quickened each time I glimpsed movement where no one should have been. Each time a guest looked startled, glancing over their shoulder as though something brushed them. And always the same refrain. His hands were too cold to touch. One night, while clearing plates, I heard a couple at my elbow murmur about the waiter who had poured their wine earlier. They asked if he was new, if he was ill, if he was all right. I forced myself to ask what he looked like, though I already knew the answer. Thin, pale, silent. When I left their table, my own hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped the tray. I slipped through the swinging doors, heart hammering, eyes darting toward the pantry. The air there was colder than it had any right to be. And in the silence behind the walls, I swore I heard it again. Cutlery clattering, a tray shifting in skeletal fingers, waiting for the next guest to complain. It has become a pattern now, one I cannot ignore no matter how much I try to bury it beneath the endless rhythm of service. Eduardo is always there. Not every guest sees him, most do not. They laugh, they drink, they toast their anniversaries and honeymoons under the chandeliers, blind to the thin figure drifting between tables. But some do, and the ones who do are always the same. It is the old man hunched over his soup who clutches his chest when he thinks no one is watching. It is the woman whose hands tremble too violently to lift her glass without spilling. It is the passenger pale with fever, who insists it is only seasickness, though their lips are already losing color. Those are the ones who notice him. Their eyes follow the silent waiter. Their words stumble when his cold hands brush theirs. Their voices shake when they whisper to their families. Did you feel that? And within days, sometimes hours, they are gone. A sudden heart failure, a collapse in their cabin, a body escorted quietly down to the morgue while the music above never stops playing. Their names vanish from the manifest, just as Eduardo's once did, erased in the endless churn of the ship's voyages. The other staff pretend not to see, but we all know. We share quick glances when a guest grows pale at dinner, when someone swears they saw the silent man pouring wine that no one else poured. We know that Eduardo still serves. He takes no orders, speaks no words, but his presence is always the same: a cold brush, a hollow stare, a tray that never clatters no matter how thin his arms become. I have tried to catch him, to force my eyes to follow when he slips through the crowd. But the moment I near the swinging doors, he is gone, back into the pantry or down into the steel belly where light does not reach. All that lingers is the sound, the faint, steady clatter of silverware echoing through walls that should be solid. I tell myself not to think of it, but at night I cannot sleep. I picture the dining hall empty, chandeliers unlit, the long tables stretched out in silence. And there he is, Eduardo, moving between them, filling glasses no one will drink from, serving dishes to shadows, his eyes sunk deep and pleading, his lips pressed tight against words he can no longer speak. The worst part is not that he is trapped. The worst part is that he is still working, bound to a duty that does not end, waiting for the next guest who belongs to him. And if what the others whisper is true, if only those near death can truly see him, then I know what it means if his hollow eyes ever find mine. So I keep my head down when I serve, and I pray with everything I have that I never sit at Eduardo's table. Because if I do, the tray he carries will not be for someone else. It will be for me. The lower decks were my world, the place where the glamour of the cruise ship above didn't reach. No chandeliers, no laughter, no music. Just the hum of engines, the hiss of pipes, the stink of rust and salt trapped in sweating steel. My job was to keep the ship alive, tighten the joints, patch the leaks, bleed the air from the rattling lines that fed water through its veins. It was lonely work, buried beneath the celebration. But I liked it that way. At least I did until the nights when the knocking began. It was always late, when the passengers had retreated to their cabins, and even most of the crew slept. I'd be crouched with a wrench in hand, sweat dripping into my eyes, the taste of oil thick on my tongue. That's when I'd hear it. A sound that froze me in place, echoing through the steel around me. Not the groan of the ship straining against waves, not the random shudder of water pressing against the hull. This was different. This was deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. 3 strikes, always the same, ringing through the metal with a rhythm too steady to be chance. I held my breath, ears straining, waiting for it to fade. Sometimes it did. Other times it repeated, louder, closer, as though whoever was making the sound knew I was listening. At first I told myself it was debris, maybe a loose container drifting at sea, striking the hull by accident. But no accident repeats in such perfect rhythm, at the same time each night. And when I pressed my palm against the steel, I could feel it. The vibration traveling through the wall, pulsing into my skin like a heartbeat. The other workers brushed it off when I asked. They laughed, muttered about nerves, told me to get used to the ship's moods. But the way their eyes shifted, the way their voices dropped when the subject came up, told me they'd heard it too. They just refused to name it. Naming things makes them real. I tried to bury myself in the work, but the knocking always returned. Sometimes it moved along the hull, sliding from one panel of steel to the next, following me as I worked. Sometimes it came from deep below, down where the ship's shadow touched the blackest part of the sea. But always, it was the same rhythm. Slow, patient, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. I began to dread those nights. Dread being alone with only the steel between me and whatever pressed against it from the dark. My tools felt useless in my hands, my breath quick and shallow in my chest. I started to wonder if it was trying to communicate, if the rhythm was a message I wasn't meant to understand. Or worse, what if it was an invitation? Because sometimes, when the knocking stopped, the silence that followed felt heavier, hungrier, like something just outside the hull was waiting for me to answer back. I clung to the lie that it was machinery. Ships make noises, groans, rattles, the endless churn of the engines. That's what I told myself when the knocks came again the next night, sharper this time, echoing through the steel like someone rapping on the door to my own chest. I crouched by the pipes, wrench in hand, waiting for the rhythm to fade. But it didn't. It persisted, steady and deliberate, almost expectant. I pressed my ear to the hull, the metal cold enough to bite my skin. The sound came clearer that way. Not random strikes, not the chaos of waves or drifting debris. It was patterned. A pause between beats, then another set. Tap, tap. Silence, tap, 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 silence. Over and over, as though someone was arranging the knocks into phrases, into words. My throat went dry. I pulled back, staring at the wall as though it might answer me. I tried to laugh it off, tried to imagine gears slipping, some pipe hammering from pressure. But no machine spoke like that. Machines didn't send sequences, didn't repeat patterns, as if waiting for acknowledgement. The next time I heard it, I made the mistake of answering. I raised the wrench in my hand and knocked back. Just once, soft, tentative. A foolish impulse I regretted the second the sound left me. The steel stayed quiet for a moment, long enough that I thought it had ended. Relief started to spread through me until the response came. Knock, knock, knock. 3 strikes, louder than before, vibrating so hard through the wall it rattled the pipes at my side. I stumbled back, my breath shallow, heart hammering against my ribs. It had heard me. Whatever was outside in the black water had understood, and it was pleased. The pattern grew more complex after that. Some nights it was 2 short knocks, then a pause. Other nights it was 4 quick strikes, followed by 1 heavy thud that made the floor tremble. I didn't know the code, but I knew what it meant. Someone, or something, was trying to talk. I stopped telling the others. They didn't want to hear it, didn't want to admit the truth I could no longer ignore. The sea was knocking, and it wasn't empty. One night, as I sat in silence, refusing to move, the sequence shifted again. Knock, knock, silence, knock, knock, silence. The rhythm was steady, insistent, a message hammered over and over into the steel. My skin prickled as I realized what it resembled. A heartbeat, slow and deliberate, pulsing through the hull as if the ship itself had become a chest enclosing something alive. I ran then, leaving my tools behind, but even as I climbed the stairs, I could feel the rhythm following me. The hull was answering back, carrying the message through every deck, whispering its steady beat into the bones of the ship. And though I tried to drown it out with laughter above, I couldn't unhear the truth. The ocean was speaking, and sooner or later, it wanted me to reply again. I told myself I wouldn't answer again. That first time had been a mistake, an instinct I should have ignored. But curiosity is a sickness, and down in the humming dark of the hull, it festers. When the knocking returned, louder and sharper than before, I sat with my wrench gripped tight and my pulse hammering, staring at the wall as if it were a face. The rhythm was patient, deliberate, like fingertips drumming on a table while waiting for me to gather courage. I should have walked away. Instead, I raised the wrench again and tapped back. Once, twice. The silence that followed stretched too long. I felt it pressing against me, heavy, suffocating. Then came the reply. Knock. The whole wall shivered. The bolts along the pipe above my head rattled, one dropping loose and clinking across the floor. Another strike came, heavier, so forceful it shook the tools from my belt. The vibrations traveled through the steel, crawling into my bones, making my teeth ache. It was closer. Not outside, not far away, but pressed right against the hull, as though something enormous was leaning its weight into the ship, answering my foolish invitation with its own. The rhythm had changed too. No longer random phrases I couldn't decipher. This was insistent, urgent. Knock, 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 each strike heavier than the last, each one rattling more bolts loose, until I was sure the wall itself would split open. My knees buckled, and I dropped to the floor, my palms pressed against my ears, though it did nothing to block the sound. I scrambled for the bolts, tried to tighten them back into place, but the metal quivered so violently that the wrench slipped in my sweaty grip. It felt like the ship was groaning, begging me to fix what I had unleashed. The pipes hissed and screamed, steam bursting from a joint, as if the vessel itself was in pain. Still, the knocking came, closer and closer, shaking dust from the ceiling. My breath caught when I realized the rhythm matched the one I had tapped. A mirror of my answer. It wasn't just noise. It was repeating me, mocking me, calling me back into the conversation I had started. I staggered backward, my chest heaving, eyes fixed on the trembling wall. I expected to see it bow inward, dent with the force of the unseen hands or claws beating against it. For a heartbeat, I swore I saw the outline of something pressed against the steel, broad and shifting, as if the sea itself had a face and was trying to push through. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse, stretching long and hollow, as though the ocean outside had drawn back to listen. My tools lay scattered, bolts missing, the pipe hissing faintly with escaping steam. I wanted to believe it was over. But deep down, I knew the truth. When you knock on a door, something on the other side always decides whether to open it. And I had already knocked twice. After that night, I swore I would never answer again. I left my wrench hanging untouched, forced my hands to remain still when the knocking came. I thought if I starved it of response, if I refused to play its game, it would fade back into the black water that had birthed it. But the sea doesn't forgive curiosity. Once you've made contact, it remembers you. The next night, I heard it again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. It followed me as I worked along the pipes, the rhythm growing heavier with each shift. No matter where I went, the sound traveled with me, crawling through the walls like it knew exactly where I stood. At first, it was only near the hull, the steel trembling faintly beneath my boots. Then it spread. I'd hear it farther down the corridors, echoing through corners where no ocean should touch. I would lie in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, and feel the frame of the bed shiver with each strike. Even above deck, in the hum of passenger laughter, I swore I felt the vibrations underfoot, faint but insistent, as though the ship itself carried the pounding in its bones. The rhythm changed too, no longer the patient taps of someone waiting for acknowledgement. Now it was violent. Fists slamming, demanding, pounding against the steel with such force, I half expected to see the walls dent inward. Each night it grew worse, like something was testing the strength of its prison, eager to break free. I begged the others to admit they heard it, but they only shook their heads, their eyes slipping away. I knew then they weren't denying out of disbelief. They were denying out of fear. Some of them had heard it before, years back, and had learned the same lesson I was only beginning to understand. You never acknowledge it twice. But silence is not protection. The knocking didn't stop. It hunted me. When I crouched to tighten bolts, it struck so hard above my head that rust fell like rain onto my shoulders. When I carried tools down the corridor, the sound erupted behind me, footsteps of fists hammering in pursuit. My heart beat in time with it, frantic, ragged, as though it were trying to sync itself with me. One night, the pounding grew so violent and the lights flickered and a pipe burst open, scalding steam flooding the hall. I choked, blinded, but even through the hiss of vapor I heard it. Boom, boom, boom. So close it felt like the wall would cave, like a giant hand was curled just on the other side of the steel, slamming again and again for release. I ran then, tools clattering from my grip, lungs burning as I tore through the lower decks. But the knocking followed, rising from every wall, echoing through the ship like a heartbeat that was no longer outside but within. I hadn't answered, hadn't touched the wall again. But it didn't matter. I had already knocked once, twice, and whatever was out there had decided that was enough to claim me. I thought the knocking would be the end of it, that the sound alone was the punishment for my mistake. But the sea has a way of making itself seen when sound is no longer enough. The first dent appeared on a routine inspection, a small outward bulge in the steel that caught the glow of my flashlight. I froze, heart stuttering. The hull should have been pressed inward from the weight of the ocean, but this was the opposite. It looked as if something inside had struck with such force it bent the steel toward the water. I called it in, of course, but the officers dismissed it as pressure damage, a flaw in construction. They scribbled it into their reports and turned away, their faces pale, their voices too quick. They didn't believe what they said, not really. The dents grew after that. Night by night, I returned to find new ones. Some were the size of my hand, shallow but undeniable. Others were wide and deep, stretching across whole panels like a giant palm had pressed from within. I traced the edges with trembling fingers, feeling the warping of bolts that had once held firm. And still, the knocking continued, each strike leaving behind another scar in the steel. Soon the dents weren't just outward. Some pressed inward too, smaller but just as wrong, as if something outside was clawing for entry. I stood there, caught between two truths I didn't want to name. Either something inside the ship was trying to escape, or something in the Black Sea was trying to climb in. The thought hollowed me. I began to see shapes in the warped metal. Ridges that looked like knuckles, curves that seemed like shoulders straining to push through. In the silence between knocks, I imagined breath, hot and foul, steaming against the walls. The ship groaned under the strain, her bones quivering as if she too felt the weight of what pressed against her skin. One evening, I found a dent so fresh the steel was still warm, trembling faintly beneath my hand. I pressed my ear against it, breath held tight, and what I heard was not knocking. It was scraping. A long, dragging sound, like nails or claws searching for purchase. Then came the low rumble, a sound deeper than thunder, vibrating through the hull until my chest ached. I stumbled back, dropping my wrench, eyes locked on the bulge in the steel. For a moment, I swore it shifted, swelling outward like something was drawing in breath, preparing to force its way through. I fled then, unable to watch, unable to wait for the moment the wall split. Now, I avoid that part of the ship. But others have noticed. They whisper about the dents, about the strange warping of the steel. They ask what could cause it, and I have no answer I can speak aloud. All I know is this. Every night, the knocking grows louder, and the dents grow deeper. And one day soon, the steel won't hold. Something will finally break through. And whether it's climbing in or out, none of us will survive the moment the ocean answers back. The children's playroom was meant to be cheerful, a safe corner of the ship, where parents could leave their little ones while they sipped cocktails under chandeliers. The walls were painted in pastels, cartoon fish swimming endlessly across chipped plaster. Piles of toys cluttered every corner, dolls with tangled hair, plastic blocks, stuffed animals missing eyes. To most, it looked harmless, even sweet. To me, it was a pastel prison, filled with the noise of children trying to forget they were trapped on a floating hotel in the middle of the sea. Most of them laughed, screamed, fought over toy trucks or toppled towers of blocks. But one boy, quiet, thin, with hair that fell into his eyes, kept to himself. He refused to sit with the others, refused to touch the dolls or puzzles, refused even to laugh. He would only sit cross-legged near the wall, hugging his knees, his eyes darting often to the single wide window that looked out into the endless gray of the sea. I tried coaxing him once, kneeling beside him with a smile I hoped looked reassuring. "You don't want to play?" I asked. He only shook his head, pulling his knees tighter. When I followed his gaze to the window, I saw nothing but rolling waves and the occasional seabird. But his small voice whispered, cracked and certain, "She's there." "Who?" I asked. "The girl," he said, his lips barely moving. "Outside the window, she frightens me." The words sank into me like ice. I turned back quickly, half expecting to see a face pressed to the glass. Of course, there was nothing. Just water, endless and shifting, gray against gray. No girl could be there. We were 5 decks above the surface, miles from land. I laughed nervously, patted his shoulder, told him he was imagining things. But the boy's eyes never wavered and never blinked. He whispered again, as though confiding a secret too heavy for his small chest. She smiles at me. She wants me to come outside. I hushed him, forced myself to return to the other children, but his words burrowed deep. Every time I passed the window, I found myself glancing sideways, heart tight in my throat. Nothing. Only water, churning endlessly, slapping against the hull. But sometimes, only sometimes, I thought I caught the faintest blur, a suggestion of pale skin beneath the waves. That night, as I locked the playroom and turned out the lights, I glanced back at the darkened window. For a moment, I swore I saw the outline of a hand pressed flat against the glass. Too small, too pale. The fingers spread wide in a silent plea. I told myself it was a trick of reflection, the shadow of my own hand on the glass. But as I turned away, the boy's voice echoed in my head. She wants me to come outside. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the window wasn't meant to keep her out. It was meant to keep her from coming in. I told myself the boy's whispers were just imagination, the kind children carry with them when the world is too large and frightening to understand. I repeated it like a mantra every time he sat in the corner, knees pulled tight, eyes locked on the window. I even scolded myself for believing his fear had seeped into me. But denial is fragile, and the sea doesn't care how tightly you cling to reason. It was late afternoon, the playroom buzzing with the shrill chaos of children. I was gathering blocks from the carpet when the air shifted. A hush fell over the room, not complete silence, but something heavier, like the sound had been pushed down underwater. My chest tightened. Before I knew it, my eyes slid toward the window. That's when I saw her. Her face was pressed flat against the glass, so pale it seemed almost luminous, as though the sea itself had carved her from bone and left her drifting there. Her hair floated around her head in slow strands, moving as though caught in currents that didn't belong to air, but to water. Her eyes, God, her eyes, were open too wide, unblinking, twin voids staring straight into the playroom. The glass trembled faintly, a vibration that rattled through the toys closest to it. One doll toppled over, its plastic eyes staring at her in uncanny mimicry. My heart stuttered, and the blocks spilled from my hands, clattering to the floor. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only stare back at her as her lips curled into the faintest of smiles, a slow stretch that didn't belong to a child at all. My knees nearly gave out under me, but the worst part wasn't her face, or her eyes, or her smile. It was the children. They didn't scream. They didn't cry. They simply froze where they stood, their laughter cut short, their small heads turning in unison toward the window. Their silence was louder than any sound could have been. And in that silence, the boy in the corner whispered without looking away, "See? I told you." Her hand rose then, pale and thin, pressing against the glass with fingers spread wide. The window misted around the outline of her palm, as though her skin was colder than the sea itself. For a heartbeat, I thought the glass might shatter, that water would come rushing in with her. But it didn't. She only lingered, smiling that awful smile, as the children watched her like moths caught in a flame's pull. I stumbled back, bumping into a shelf of toys that rattled and collapsed around me. The sound broke the spell. The children blinked, the room filling once more with their nervous chatter, their laughter pitched too high, forced, brittle. When I looked again, The window was empty. Only the gray sea stretched beyond. But the boy still sat in his corner, arms tight around his knees. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through everything. "She knows you saw her now." I couldn't keep what I'd seen to myself. My hands shook too badly. My voice cracked when I tried to steady it. But I reported it anyway. The words felt ridiculous coming out of my mouth. A girl outside the playroom window. But they lodged in me, like splinters I couldn't dig out. Security arrived with their radios crackling. 2 men with tired eyes who looked more annoyed than concerned. They asked if I'd been drinking, if I was overworked, if maybe it was just a trick of light on the glass. Still, procedure was procedure. They unlocked the maintenance hatch that led to the narrow ledge outside. A strip of steel meant only for inspection and cleaning. One of them clipped a harness and stepped carefully into the wind. The sea heaved below, gray waves smashing against the hull, spraying cold salt into the air. I stood with the other guard inside, arms folded tight against my chest, staring at the glass as though she might appear again at any second. The radio crackled. "Clear. Nothing here?" the man outside reported, his voice flat, bored even. He stomped along the ledge, beam of his flashlight cutting across the steel. "No one's out here. No way anyone could be. We're 5 decks above waterline." But as he spoke, my eyes fell to the window. The smear was still there. Pale marks streaked across the glass, faint but undeniable. The outline of fingers, small and splayed, pressed hard enough to leave greasy trails like a child's hands after clutching a pain too long. There were more than one, overlapping, some higher, some lower, all clustered where her face had been. My stomach lurched. "Check again," I muttered, pointing with a trembling finger. The guard inside followed my gaze, and I saw his expression shift, lips parting slightly, the color draining from his face. He lifted his radio again, his tone sharper now. "You need to look closer, by the playroom window." The man outside leaned near the glass, his light sweeping across the surface. He paused, shifting his weight, squinting. His radio hissed. "There's streaks. Condensation, maybe. Handprints? Could be yours." "They're too small," I snapped before I could stop myself. My voice cracked on the words. "Too small to be mine. Too small to be anyone's in here." The guard beside me shot me a warning glance, a silent demand to shut up. But it was too late. My heart thundered as the truth pressed itself harder into me. They weren't smears of cleaning cloths, weren't fog left from a shift in air temperature. They were fingerprints, tiny palms flattened against the glass. The man outside lingered only a moment longer before pulling back. "Nothing. Probably tricks of humidity," he said, his voice sharp with finality. He clipped himself back inside, shaking water from his boots, refusing to meet my eyes. They left with their report tidy, their expressions locked. But I knew they'd seen it too. The smears remained long after they were gone, small hands pressed into glass where no living child should have reached. And each time I passed that window, I felt the weight of her gaze waiting on the other side. Patient, certain, knowing I could no longer deny her touch. We locked the playroom that night. The windows were scrubbed, though the smears resisted, faint streaks of tiny fingers still visible if you tilted your head just right. The supervisors insisted it was nothing. Overzealous children, nervous staff. A ship full of imaginations stoked by long nights at sea. But they kept the door bolted anyway, just in case. I told myself it was over. I told myself the quiet would return. But the ship does not give back peace once it's taken. I was making my late rounds when I passed the playroom. The corridor was dim, lit only by the dull glow of a few tired bulbs. I lingered without meaning to, my eyes drawn to the door. The small porthole window looked black, reflecting only the trembling light behind me. I was about to turn away when I heard it. Laughter, high-pitched, bright, and unmistakably a child's. It rang from the other side of the locked door, cutting through the stale silence of the hall. My stomach turned to ice. I froze, straining to listen, praying I'd imagined it. But then came another sound, the sharp snap of rope striking the floor in a steady rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. A skipping rope. The sound built into a pattern, the kind children chant when they play, laughter spilling over it, bouncing in wild bursts. My breath came shallow, misting in the cold air of the corridor. There were no children inside. I had seen the door locked. I had checked it myself. I edged closer, heart slamming in my chest. The laughter grew louder, echoing off the painted walls within, filling the pastel prison with a joy that had no place at this hour. I pressed my ear against the door, the wood cool beneath my skin, and what I heard then was worse than laughter. Whispers, children whispering in unison, too low to make out words, their voices weaving together like the rustle of paper tearing in the dark. And threaded between them, lighter, sharper, was the sound of one girl's giggle, stretched too long, too eager. The skipping rope hit harder, faster. Tap, 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 tap. The rhythm grew frantic, no longer playful but punishing, slamming into the floor until the boards beneath seemed to shake. I stumbled back, every nerve screaming to run, but my eyes clung to the porthole, unable to look away. For a moment, I thought I saw movement within, just beyond the glass, a blur of pale hair drifting as though underwater, the faint outline of a face turning toward me, lips parted in a smile that did not belong to any living child. The sound stopped all at once. Rope, laughter, whispers, silence. The corridor returned to stillness, the porthole reflecting only my pale, horrified face. I backed away slowly, refusing to turn my back on the door. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped my keys. But even as I stumbled down the hall, the echo of that rope striking the floor followed me, steady and patient, as if daring me to return and count how many times it would fall before the glass finally cracked. The playroom never felt safe again after that night. Even locked, even abandoned, it carried an atmosphere that crept into your skin the moment you passed the door. The pastel walls looked faded. The cartoon fish on the paint seemed to swim slower, their smiles more strained. Parents didn't notice, of course. They left their children in our care, trusting the space to be harmless. But the children knew. They always know. It began the same way every voyage. Whispers, small voices, secretive and trembling, passed between them as they built towers of blocks or colored with broken crayons. They spoke of the girl at the window, the one who waits outside with her hair floating in the sea, smiling through the glass. I would hear them mid-sentence, their words dropping into silence when I drew too close, their eyes darting toward the window before quickly looking away. No matter how brightly I spoke, no matter how many games I offered, the whispers always returned. Some of the children even left toys near the window, small offerings, stuffed bears with missing eyes, dolls with faded dresses, as though they believed gifts might keep her at bay. But the boy who first warned me had been right all along. She doesn't want toys. She wants someone to come outside. And every voyage, someone does. Not in front of everyone, not in the middle of the day. It always happens quietly, during the long nights when the sea swallows the ship's lights. A child goes missing. Sometimes they vanish from the playroom itself, slipping away in the seconds when no one is looking. Other times it is from their cabins, their parents waking to find the bed empty, the sheets cold, the door still locked from the inside. Panic spreads. Security combs the decks. The captain assures the passengers everything is under control. But we who work here know. We know where they've gone. The ocean takes them. Or worse, she does. Her face appears more often now. Pressed to the glass, eyes too wide, mouth stretched into that unnatural smile. Sometimes she brings her hand up and taps, a gentle knock, as though reminding us that she's still there, still waiting. And each time, the children grow quieter, their play more subdued, their whispers sharper with fear. I've stopped asking them what they see. The answers only chill me more. One child told me she sings. Another said she beckons. A third, with tears streaking his face, whispered that she had asked him by name. I tell myself I am only here to work, that what happens is beyond my control. But each voyage, when the announcement comes that a child cannot be found, my stomach knots in sick recognition. I picture her pale face, her drifting hair, her hand pressed flat to the glass. And I know the ship will sail on, passengers dancing and drinking above, while beneath them the sea grows heavier with secrets. Because the truth is this: she never leaves empty-handed. One child always disappears. And one day, when she smiles through the glass, it will be my name, she whispers next. They told me the 13th deck didn't exist, at least not for passengers. It was listed as under renovation in every brochure, cordoned off with signs warning of construction, a place meant to be ignored. Most ships skip the number altogether, but ours carried it like a scar, hidden away just below the decks filled with music and light. And on my last assignment, I was sent there. Closing duties, they called it. Simple, routine, nothing to worry about. The stairwell that led up was dimmer than the others, the bulbs buzzing weakly overhead. My footsteps echoed too loud, as though the ship itself was emptying around me. The air changed the higher I climbed, colder, tinged with a sour smell like wet plaster and salt. When I pushed open the heavy door at the top, I realized why no one wanted guests to see this place. The 13th deck looked abandoned, but not with the honesty of a place left alone. The carpet was rolled back in strips, exposing warped boards beneath. Wallpaper peeled in long curls from the walls, paint bubbled from damp. Furniture sat draped in dusty sheets, their shapes hulking in the shadows, like bodies waiting to be uncovered. The air was thick, heavy, humming faintly with the vibration of the engines far below. I told myself to move quickly, to check the locks, sweep the halls, and leave. But the silence unsettled me. Every shift I'd worked until then had carried the sounds of life, the clatter of cutlery, the thump of music, the shuffle of feet. Here, there was nothing. Only the faint groan of steel shifting with the sea and the whisper of my own breath. As I moved down the corridor, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed longer here, the corners sharper. Once, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, soft as bare feet on wood, but when I turned, the hall stretched empty, lined with doors marked with numbers that shouldn't have been in use. One door stood slightly ajar, its brass handle tarnished with green. I hesitated, my keyring heavy in my pocket, before nudging it open with the tip of my shoe. The room beyond was stripped bare, no bed, no curtains, only walls darkened by water stains that traced downward like long fingers. The smell was stronger there, salt and mildew wrapped together, thick enough to sting my throat. I shut it quickly, heart racing, and pressed on. Each door I passed seemed to lean toward me, The numbers warped as if melted. The signs of renovation were everywhere. But it didn't feel like a place being repaired. It felt like a place abandoned for reasons no one would name. By the time I reached the far end of the corridor, I understood why they sent me there for my final shift. It wasn't work that needed doing. It was a ritual, a test. The 13th deck wasn't meant for guests, and maybe it wasn't meant for staff either. It was a place the ship kept for itself, a place that had been waiting for me long before I set foot on it. The corridor stretched too long, every surface humming with that sickly yellow glow from the overhead bulbs. Their buzzing filled the silence, a low insect drone that pressed into my skull. The wallpaper peeled in wide strips, edges curled like dead skin, and the carpet squelched faintly beneath my shoes, as though it had absorbed more than just damp air. The 13th deck wasn't just abandoned. It was rotting, alive with the quiet patience of a wound that had never healed. I kept walking, forcing myself to take each step slow and steady. The orders were simple: check the locks, sweep the hall, report back. But the deeper I went, the more the air shifted. Cold drafts coiled along the corridor, brushing the back of my neck like the faintest breath. I told myself it was ventilation, bad insulation, some practical reason. But my body didn't believe me. My body knew I wasn't alone. The first time I felt it was small, almost subtle. The faintest sense of weight behind me, a pressure at my back, as though the space just over my shoulder was no longer empty. I stopped, and the feeling stopped with me. My ears strained in the silence, every nerve sparking. I turned, quick, sudden, only to find the hallway empty. Shadows stretched long across warped wallpaper. Nothing moved. I exhaled, too fast, and told myself to keep going. But as soon as I started forward again, I heard it. The soft drag of a step, the faint shuffle of something mimicking my pace, falling into rhythm with me. I froze mid-stride. The sound stopped. My chest tightened. I tried to trick it then, walking 3 quick steps, pausing, then 1 slow step. And each time, the sound followed, mirrored perfectly. Step for step, pause for pause, as though whoever or whatever was behind me was waiting for me to lead the dance. I didn't turn again. Some part of me, deeper than reason, whispered not to. That if I looked back, if I gave it the acknowledgement it wanted, it wouldn't stay behind me any longer. So I walked with my eyes locked forward, each bulb buzzing faintly above, casting 6 shadows along the warped floor. My breath echoed in my ears, shallow, ragged. Behind me, the steps followed, never too close, never too far, but always in perfect imitation. The corridor seemed endless. I passed doors that looked melted, their brass numbers warped and unreadable. One was open a crack, dark inside, and I swore I saw the faintest movement beyond. Something shifting away from the light. I hurried past, the unseen weight keeping pace behind me, patient as a shadow. When I finally reached the stairwell door at the end, I nearly collapsed with relief. My hand shook as I wrapped my fingers around the handle, pressing down hard. But before I pushed it open, the buzzing above cut out. The light died. The corridor behind me was swallowed in black. The steps came again, only this time, not in rhythm with mine. Faster, closer. The sound of bare feet slapping wet against the floor, rushing toward me from the dark I dared not turn to face. I shoved the door open and stumbled into the stairwell, heart pounding, breath ripping from my lungs. The door slammed shut behind me with a hollow clang. I didn't look back, but I knew, in the marrow of my bones, that whatever followed me on the 13th deck hadn't stayed there. It had only learned how to match my steps. and it was patient. It could follow forever. I thought the stairwell had saved me. The clang of the door shutting, the echo of my footsteps on concrete, the faint smell of rust and paint. Mundane things, ordinary things, felt like safety. I told myself the steps that chased me had been imagination, nerves stretched too thin by the sickly hum of the 13th deck. But when I reached the next landing and turned, my eyes betrayed me. There it was, a shadow. It stretched long across the wall, dark and warped, moving where the light should not have bent. At first I thought it was mine, cast strange by the angle of the stairwell bulb. I lifted my hand, fingers trembling, testing it. My hand rose, the shadow's hand stayed down. I froze, blood roaring in my ears. Slowly, I began to move again, trying to trick it, darting around corners, turning quickly up the next flight. But each time I checked, it was there, stretched impossibly long across the wall, dragging itself along the edges, though no one was there to cast it. The light above flickered, buzzing, and for a split second, the stairwell plunged into darkness. In that instant, the shadow swelled, spreading wider across the walls, crawling closer, its shape bending like smoke. When the bulb sputtered back to life, the shadow thinned again, retreating, but never disappearing. I tried not to breathe too loudly, tried to convince myself to keep climbing, one foot in front of the other. But the sound of its movement was not silent. It scraped, not like footsteps, but like something dragging across the floor. A slow pull of weight that left the air sour, metallic, heavy in my lungs. On the third landing, I caught it trying to get ahead of me. I saw its stretched form curve around the corner before I reached it, bending where the wall bent, as though it had already been waiting there. My pulse hammered. I could no longer pretend this was some trick of light. The shadow wasn't following me. It was hunting me. I pressed my back to the wall, closing my eyes, whispering under my breath that it wasn't real, that shadows don't move without bodies, that nothing was behind me. But when I opened them again, its arms had grown longer, clawing shapes stretching up toward the ceiling. The flicker of the bulb sent its fingers twitching, reaching, always just shy of touching me. I bolted then, tearing up the stairs 2-3 steps at a time, my breath ragged. My hands skimmed the railing slick with condensation. The shadow kept pace, spilling across the walls, sliding across. The ceiling stretched too far to ever be natural. By the time I crashed through another heavy door into a new corridor, I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. The hall stretched empty before me, stripped bare like the others. But the shadow came with me. I could see it bleeding along the wall, dark and patient, stretching where it had no right to be. And in the silence, I understood the truth. You can run from footsteps. You can hide from eyes. But you cannot escape a shadow once it's learned how to move on its own. I stumbled down the corridor, breath tearing at my throat, every nerve burning with the need to escape. The shadow clung close, dragging itself along the walls, distorting with every flicker of the failing lights. Ahead of me stood the exit stairwell, salvation marked in flaking red paint. I threw myself at the handle, wrenching it down with both hands. It didn't move. The door rattled in its frame, metal groaning, but it held firm as if welded shut. I pulled harder, slamming my shoulder against it until pain shot through my arm. Still, it refused to open. Behind me, the corridor had gone unnervingly quiet. I turned slowly, chest heaving. The shadow no longer clung flat to the walls. It was swelling, thickening, detaching itself from the surface like tar dripping into the air. Its edges curled and quivered as though struggling to find shape, and then, horribly, it did. Arms stretched out first, thin and wrong, bending too many times before settling into form, then legs, twitching as they unspooled from the dark. Last came the head, a warped oval at first that slowly sharpened, settling into angles I recognized far too well. It was me. The thing stood at the end of the hall, its body slick and shimmering like oil. But its face was my own. The eyes were too black, the mouth too wide, but every line, every contour belonged to me. I felt as though I were looking into a mirror warped by nightmares. I backed against the stairwell door, pressing so hard the handle bit into my spine. My legs trembled, refusing to carry me farther. The figure tilted its head, mimicking the gesture I made without realizing it. When I lifted a trembling hand in front of me, it raised its own in perfect unison. For a terrible moment, I thought it was only a reflection, some trick of light gone mad. But then it stepped forward. The floor groaned beneath its weight, its footfalls wet and deliberate. Its smile widened, pulling at the edges of my own mouth until I thought my skin might split in sympathy. I slammed my hands against the stairwell door again, panic clawing at me, but the lock held. The thing kept walking, slow and certain, its eyes never leaving mine. The bulbs overhead flickered violently, buzzing like angry bees, throwing its form in and out of clarity. Sometimes it was me, every detail exact. Sometimes it was only a mass of smoke and claws. Each flash of light brought it closer, until it was only feet away, its breathless silence louder than any scream. I pressed harder against the door, nails clawing at the metal. But there was no way out. My double stopped in front of me, inches away. Its face split into that awful smile that was mine, but not mine. And then it lifted its hand, slow, deliberate, pressing its palm against my chest. The touch was freezing, searing straight through skin and bone. And for the first time, the shadow spoke. Not in sound, but in the way my own voice echoed back at me, inside me, claiming it had finally found a body to belong to. They told my family I went missing at sea. That was the official report. One more nameless disappearance swallowed by waves, filed neatly in a drawer to be forgotten. But the truth is not so merciful. I was never given to the water. I was taken by the ship itself, folded into the rotting marrow of its 13th deck. When they searched, they found nothing. My uniform was gone, my tools missing. The stairwell door sealed as though it had never been touched. The supervisors muttered about fatigue, about accidents, about the way crew sometimes slip overboard when no one is looking. Easier to explain me away as clumsy, careless, already claimed by the deep. No one wanted to talk about the 13th deck. No one ever does. But the passengers do. Even now I hear them. Whispers carried from voyage to voyage. Little scraps of rumor traded over buffet dinners and hushed drinks. Some swear they've seen me still working. A crew member no one recognizes, always on the wrong deck, walking corridors marked as closed for renovation. They say I smile when they pass, polite and distant, the way staff are trained to do. But my smile is too wide, my eyes too dark. Others describe catching sight of me in reflections, in windows, in mirrors, in the polished silver rails along the halls. Their photos never capture it. The faces blur, static clouds where my features should be. But I am there, always smiling, always identical. And sometimes, the bravest or the most foolish wander where they shouldn't, slipping past ropes and signs to explore the forgotten deck. They find the corridors stripped bare, the lights buzzing sickly yellow, and at the far end, they see me. My uniform still neat, my hands folded behind my back, my shadow stretched too long across the wall. I watch them, waiting, head tilting just so. A reflection made flesh. Those who glimpse me there never linger long. They leave with trembling hands and swear they won't return. But some do. The ship has a way of drawing them back. And when they walk too far, when the door behind them slams shut and refuses to open, they learn what I did, that the 13th deck isn't empty. It is hungry. I no longer remember the feel of sun on my skin, or the taste of air that isn't thick with salt and mildew. My life ended that shift, though my body still walks. I am still here, pacing that endless corridor, turning corners that only lead back to themselves. Trapped in a loop the ship keeps alive. They never found me after that shift. But sometimes, late at night, when the passengers grow curious, they glimpse me on that empty deck, still smiling, still working, still trapped. And if they stare too long, if they dare to follow, they may find themselves mirrored too. Another body for the ship to claim, another shadow for the corridor to wear.